Well, it's great to be with you, and I'm sure that I know from past experience teaching here a year ago when I attempted to cram 20 centuries of church history into 4 weeks, that a few people came after missing the first week and was like, oh my gosh, I've missed like 6 centuries. What can I do to catch up? Hence the video. And believe it or not, several hundred people watched those videos. Not all of them from San Marino Community Church, but it was a large group. And so I'm taking the precaution of recording this lecture as well. And you think, we're going to cover the Gospels and Acts in 50 minutes? That's insane. Well, believe me, you're not going to learn everything that you would in my MDiv level graduate course on the Gospels and Acts. Not by a long shot, but you will get an introduction to things, not from a layperson's level, but more from the point of view of the academic discussion that's been going on in this field for the last 150 years. So what I hope this will do is equip you to understand what's going on and has been going on for some time in this area, and perhaps open your eyes to some possibilities for understanding the Gospel and Acts in a new way, good ways. Because there are many questions today about the Gospels, the New Testament in general. A few centuries ago, no one would ever ask these questions. Nobody questioned the Word of God. You know, if you were within the Protestant Reformation as Presbyterians, well, there's this exaggerated reverence for Scripture because, after all, the Reformation was built around the right of individual people to read Scripture for themselves and understand it as God has put it into writing all those centuries ago. Now, if you're in the Catholic tradition, heaven forbid that you would ask questions, because that's what priests are for. They do all the thinking. You don't have to ask anything. You just show up. Well, questions about the New Testament are a relatively new thing. Questions like, who wrote it? The traditional answer has always been, well, Matthew wrote Matthew, right? Let's get to that in a minute. I heard that laugh. But, when? And, well, the first century? I would agree with you. But there are those, most of them have passed off the stage by now, who thought, oh no, the Gospels weren't completed until the 2nd century. But that's ancient 19th century thinking. Is it historical? Well, that's a loaded question, because the way you define history will give you the answer to that. Why these 27 books? And thanks to the contribution to the noise level on the subject of the New Testament by the popular author and non-scholar Dan Brown, who has insisted that he's more than an author, he's also an expert. There's many people who have become convinced that the church somehow weeded out all the really interesting books, or the ones that didn't suit Constantine's political prejudices. And so we'll take on that as well under the heading of why these 27 books. Well, let's go back to the authorship issue. Well, for approximately 18 centuries, the traditional answers were Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Because if you read Mark's Gospel there at the beginning, it says Mark. However, and I'm convinced this is a vast oversight in the great scheme of things, the authors did not specifically identify themselves in their works. This is an attribution. I hesitate to bring up the name of William Shakespeare because it is so polarizing. Heaven forbid that if you get a person who follows in the footsteps of Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, who is utterly convinced that the person who wrote the plays attributed to Shakespeare could not possibly have been whom he calls the butcher's boy from Avon, right? But the plays are there. The plays are amazing. They're associated with his name. I brought this up with 2 different Shakespeare scholars over the years. Boy, it's a conversation killer from the get-go. You don't want to use that as a talking point any more than on St. Patrick's Day you want to point out that, you know, St. Patrick was born of England of English stock. Not a good idea. And so nobody questioned these traditional attributions. That all changed in the 19th century thanks to Ferdinand Christian Bauer. Now, Ferdinand Christian Bauer is a name whom everybody in New Testament circles recognizes, and outside of it, it's a complete who's he. Now, he was a 19th century figure who did remarkable things in making the New Testament the subject of academic, not spiritual, discussion. Now, when was he born? It was approximately the time of our own Constitution, so the 1780s was his birth. He died in 1860, so just before our Civil War got kicked off. So that gives you a nice, comfy set of hooks to hang him on. He was most influential in the early to middle part of the 19th century. But believe me, we're still living with the consequences of Ferdinand Christian Bauer, or F.C. Bauer. See, Bauer had been deeply influenced by the German philosopher Hegel. Hegel lived and died by this concept called dialectic. The Hegelian philosophy of the dialectic, as you know, was picked up by early Marxists and then communists, and then it became the philosophy of communism that explained how opposites gave rise to each other and sort of lurched staggeringly from one extreme to another throughout history until, well, we won't go into the communist dogma of the golden state and the paradise of the proletariat. Hegel had an influence on virtually everybody of the 19th century in one way or another. Well, Ferdinand Christian Bauer heard about Hegel's philosophy and he said, bingo, that is it. That gives me a way to figure out which New Testament books were written first and which were written last. And it worked along these lines. Bauer's assumptions were that the early church was greatly divided into feuding groups, who spoke different languages, had different cultures, Greek, Hebrew, lived in and came from different places. They had different worldviews, different modes of dress and social interaction. These parties, according to Bauer, included Jewish Christianity, whom he would tend to identify with, say, James, the half-brother of Jesus, and Gentile Christianity. See, Bauer's background predisposed him to see Paul as not the apostle to the Gentiles that we've come to know and love through his writings in the New Testament and the story of his missionary journeys in the book of Acts, but no, as a theological innovator who took a kind of Messianic Judaism and completely twisted it beyond all recognition to make it into a Gentile-focused, world-embracing, global kind of Christianity that's totally different from its Jewish roots. That's how Bauer would probably put it if he were here. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that that was his position. So here's the deal. Early church, lots of conflict. As time went on and as the working of the dialectical process took place, a harmony was reached. This is Bauer's thinking, probably in the 2nd century. And so all you have to do to date a New Testament writing is to ask yourself the question, does this show signs of internal conflict between the Gentile Christianity group associated with Paul and the Jewish Christianity group associated with James and other early Jewish believers? Well, book of Galatians, one of Paul's first works, and yet it's all about this one particular area of conflict. Paul is writing the Galatians and says, in effect, have you lost your mind? You've abandoned the grace of the gospel of Christ, and you've adopted, even though you're Gentiles, some aspect of the Jewish law which didn't help the Jews. How do you think it can help you? So this conflict is so obvious there. And in Galatians, Paul makes it clear that in this respect, even Peter, with the benefit of his amazing interactions with Jesus in his earthly ministry, and then Peter's vision of this sheet being lowered from heaven and being told by God himself, what I have declared clean is clean, and then was the medium by which the first Gentiles were evangelized. Even Peter, he kind of broke down under social pressure, and he withdrew from table fellowship with Gentiles. See, that's a big part of the book of Galatians. And so Bauer would say, aha, QED. This is an obvious case of the conflict between Gentile and Jewish Christianity. Therefore, it is very early. Well, it's very early for other and obvious reasons, but this was his way of thinking. Now, fast forward to some of the last books of those 27 New Testament books. Say the writings attributed to Peter. I'll call them the letters of Peter because I tend to think that Peter really did write those letters. But many in the New Testament world would not agree with me. We'll agree to disagree at this point. So the author of Peter's letters say, and that fellow, and Paul's writings have many excellent thoughts in them as well. You should read them. So Bauer comes to that and he says, oh, this is obviously extremely late, 2nd century. It'd take a long time for the church to get over those initial divisions so that somebody associated with Peter, Jewish Christianity, would say something nice about the leader of Gentile Christianity. That would be Paul. So he did this with all of the New Testament. It had a huge impact. But the bottom line for our discussion on the Gospels is that according to Bauer, none of the Gospels were written by the traditional authors. In fact, they were all written long after they were in their graves. Now, Bauer was one of the most influential figures at his university in Germany, the University of Tübingen. And the University of Tübingen had an enormous impact not only on New Testament scholarship on the continent, but also in our country as well. And as Bauer's and his successors' ideas sort of became mainstream in American seminaries and universities, it provoked a serious reaction. Partly because, and this is kind of the red herring here, partly because they were treating the Bible in the New Testament like any other book. And to that I say, amen, of course, treat it like any other book. In other words, ask questions. Who wrote it? Under what circumstances? What can we figure out about the language or events that were going on in the background that informs our understanding? That's what reading it like any other book means to me. But there was another dark side to this idea of reading it like any other book. He rigorously supported, and this became a principle of Tübingen methodology, he rigorously supported what I call the historical principle. The historical principle is nothing can be historical if it contains mythological elements. In other words, the presence of myth disproves history. Well, what's myth? Anything having to do with the miraculous. The presence of the miraculous disproves the historicity of the work. Now, as we talk about the Gospels, we have to recognize that we come to them with certain 21st century prejudices. But the original first century authors, they had no idea what a gospel was. There was no such thing as a gospel until the first one was written. I'll give Mark the tip of the hat on that score. And so they didn't have the prejudices we have. What are some of our prejudices? To us, a gospel looks a lot like a biography. And so we expect subconsciously certain things from a biography that none of these authors committed themselves to deliver. For example, a commitment to chronology. Now we assume, because there is a rough chronology, Jesus is born, baptized by the Holy Spirit, ministry, crucifixion, resurrection. There's a sequence, right? But that does not mean that the authors were committed to presenting their picture of Christ in a chronological way. That would be sort of like demanding that a portrait artist start at the top and go back and forth across his canvas, sort of like those old line printers used to do. That would be a chronological way of creating an artistic portrait. I guess it could be done. Look at the stuff that real artists like Pissarro have done. But it wouldn't be the only way. So that's one of our issues here. Secondly, these authors obviously had a theological point to make. I mean, you can't talk about God invading planet Earth in the person of the God-man Jesus without talking about theology. So of course they're going to be talking about theology, but that doesn't make it only a theological polemic. Because if such an event happened, God became man and lived among us, you've got to talk about not just the human-to-human event interaction, but the significance of that. Why did God need to do that? Why would Jesus agree to it? What's the terms of that contract, and what was God hoping to get out of it? See, that's all theology. So this idea that the presence of the miraculous disproves the historicity of a work lingered on and still is with us to a very large extent. Now, Bauer's ascendancy came and went. Bauer's methodology was abandoned, and yet anti-supernatural presuppositions prevailed, and still do in certain circles today. The idea is that the New Testament, the Gospels in particular, do contain nuggets of the historical, but it's all embedded in a matrix of myth and legend and superstition. And you can especially detect this myth, legend, and superstition when you come to miracle stories. Well, that is imposing a very rigorous 19th century worldview onto the text of the New Testament. Well, let me take a brief digression and talk about miracles, because a lot of people are vague on miracles, and even today, the subject of miracles is often discussed in the tabloids, and there's people who believe that they've experienced miracles, and I'm distinguishing this from answered prayer. But even in that case, it will fall in one category or another. Let me tell you what I mean by this. The 19th century saw natural law as an unbroken chain of cause and effect. The 19th century was the century of determinism in physics. Atoms, even though the atomic theory of matter had not been fully realized, atoms were thought to be like billiard balls that interact in perfectly predictable ways. When two billiard balls hit and they collide off in unaccountable ways, cannot be. We live in a closed system of cause and effect where natural law governs all. Therefore, miracles were impossible by definition. See, reality is defined as a miracle-free environment where cause and effect determines everything. That's not based on observation and induction. I majored in physics at Duke University. I have some rough understanding of what the philosophy of science is supposed to be about. But the 19th century was totally committed to this unbroken chain of cause and effect. So now the 20th century is the century of quantum mechanics, but I won't go there. I know my limits. So I've come up with two different descriptions of miracles. First order miracle is an absolute suspension of natural law. This is where the natural law is broken and the fragments danced upon with glorious abandon. See, that's the kind of miracle that we see when Jesus walked on the water or turned water into wine. Boy, there's so many physical principles that are violated in that one. Or the resurrection. Good night, the laws of thermodynamics are just screaming when you talk about the resurrection. And this is why, so many scholars who are well-meaning bona fide, God-loving Christian scholars, but they've been taught this historical perspective. They find themselves compelled to explain away the miracles of Jesus. Perfect example. I had one of these kindly, wonderful gentlemen. He taught a New Testament survey course that I took when I was at Duke. In an unguarded moment, I strayed from my physics and geology baseline, and I took this course. And even based on what I knew then, I realized that he was really out there in some ways. For example, the walking on the water, Jesus knew exactly where the rocks were. And the disciples hadn't figured that out, you know. Or the feeding of the multitude, did on several occasions to different groups. He says, let me tell you how it might have happened. You know, there were this group of people that come to hear Jesus, you know, it's towards the end of the day, time for their traditional meal, and everybody had something. Like, I got a loaf of bread under my robe here. Another guy says, I got some fishes, but I don't want to share them. Look at all these people here. And finally, this little boy comes to Jesus and says, I've got some loaves and fishes. Jesus says, amazing, look at this kid. He has made his tiny little lunch, such as it is, available for us. And this caused such shame in the hearts and minds of those looking on that one by one they said, oh, well, I got a loaf of bread here. And another said, well, I got some fish. And said, well, I got some fish too. You know, and they pulled out from their secret stash of loaves and fishes enough that the whole multitude of 4,000 or 5,000, depending on which account you're looking at, was fed along with baskets left over. So it wasn't a miracle of multiplication, it was a miracle of sharing. Well, based on what I know of sociology, I would call that a miracle too, but not a first order miracle. But you see, he had no problem with that. He didn't want to abandon Jesus as the greatest religious leader ever because his message was too powerful. But how could he live with the message and life of Jesus and still maintain his, what he thought, intellectual integrity and not believe in miracles? And then there's the second order of miracle. The second order miracle, and by the way, I made up these terms, so if you want to criticize them, I'm the one to blame. A second order miracle is an extremely improbable event that violates the laws of probabilities, but we all know the laws of probability were made to be broken. You know, it violates the laws of probability with an improbable yet very timely coincidence. And just to throw out two examples at random from the New Testament. One would be when Jesus was temporarily short of change, at which he was for his entire 3-year ministry, but he wanted to pay the temple tax. And he pointed out, hey, I'm the son. I shouldn't need to pay the temple tax, but we're going to do everything by the book here. So, Peter, this is what you need to do. Go down to the Sea of Galilee, catch us a fish. And I'm sure Jesus is way ahead of him. Yes, big fish, sell. It'll take more than one fish to pay the temple tax, but I'll do my best, Jesus. But Jesus says, hold on, wait till I'm done. Take the first fish you catch, open the mouth, and inside will be a coin? Really? A silver tetradrachm? Big enough to pay 2 people's temple tax? 2 drams each? Or drachma, as the modern Greeks would say. What? Okay. And I'm sure Peter's plan B was to catch a lot of fish and sell them. But he did what Jesus said was, cut the fish. Oh boy, I feel really silly doing this, but okay, open wide, brother. Now there's no reason why that should violate the laws of nature. I could conceive of, some Roman pleasure galley sailing around and hey, flip you for who pays for the amphora of wine for dinner. Oh, dang, it's over to the side. And there goes the tetradrachm. And here comes a fish, and it grabs it up, and instead of swallowing it, gets caught. And then Peter catches it. I admit that's a very unlikely chain of circumstances, which is why it's a second-order miracle. Also in that category, I think, is the earthquake in Philippi. Recall it's Paul's second missionary journey, crossed over into Macedonia. People in Philippi accused him of un-Roman practices in teaching. They were beaten and jailed without a trial, without even bothering to find out that Paul was a Roman citizen. Anyway, there he was in jail. He and the other prisoners were apparently chained to staples that were stamped or hammered into the walls, and there's a big earthquake. But those of us who've been through big earthquakes understand the situation here. It was an earthquake sufficiently large that all of the stone was disturbed to the point that the staples fell out of the wall, thereby allowing the prisoners to be potentially liberated. It was big enough so that somehow the door to the front of the prison was opened and remained so. Yet, it wasn't just that tiny bit bigger that would have caused the whole thing to come crashing down and killing everyone inside. Well, that's a miracle any way you cut it, both on the timing, the fact that it, did just the right things for Paul and Silas, and didn't crush anybody. So I call those my two orders of miracles. And since I am committed to the cause and effect, natural order, I think that there's a lot going on with second order miracles. I could tell you some other stories, but this isn't the purpose of that talk. So let's go on and get down to brass tacks here. Let's ask the question, why are some of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call them the synoptic Gospels, so similar? And then you might ask, well, yeah, and you didn't mention John. How come it's so different? I mean, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all somewhere in the infield. And then there's John way out along the left field foul line. That just is so strange. Well, the original 19th century attempt to answer this was based on literary sources. So Mark's gospel was written first, and then both Matthew and Luke said, I better make sure that what I put together is coordinated with Mark's gospel. Ooh, this is pretty good. And so we find in between Matthew, Mark, and Luke lengthy stretches where there's almost word-for-word comparison. And in addition to that, when you pick up, say, Luke's gospel, you find these lengthy stretches that could have been lifted from Mark. I'm not saying they were. I don't think they were. I'll give you my alternative view in a while. But Luke had his own special material. Scholars call that the L material. Luke, as well as Matthew, both quoted freely from what became known as a collection of Jesus' sayings, not in Mark. So scholars ask themselves, well, where did this come from? Well, it must have circulated as a separate collection of sayings, that Jesus said that weren't a part of any of the gospel stories. Well, this became known as Q, or Quelle. The German word Quelle means source or spring, and so the letter Q designated this. And so Matthew, just to kind of be complete here, Matthew relied upon Mark. He relied on his own unique material called M, and he also relied upon Q. So this is the late 19th, early 20th century solution to why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar. The authors of each, according to this point of view, they were not eyewitnesses themselves. They lived much later than the events they were attempting to put into writing. They were a lot more editors than they were authors, because they would be going along copying from Mark, and then they'd say to themselves, this is a great place to put in one of those sayings from Jesus. Where did I have that? Somewhere here in Q. Yeah, that's the exact one. Boom, and then put it in. Now we're up to a place, where's my own special material? Yeah, I'm going to put in this story that nobody else knows. Back to Mark. And so the image you pick up is that the gospel authors were heavily reliant on written sources. Now, let me tell you that the 19th century was heavily reliant on written sources. Libraries, academic journals, scholarly works. goes all the way back to the time of printing and before. But new insights have arisen in, of all things, the 20th century from the most unlikely source. Not biblical studies, not archaeology, anthropology. Now, who expected anthropology? You know, people going off and visiting tribes and understanding how they live. Well, what people discovered in the 20th century was that pre-literate societies are not ignorant. They don't have libraries, they don't have books, but they have vast quantities of information, sometimes stories, sometimes useful lists of kings and who's descended from whom, or sometimes who owns this and who owned it before them, and so on and so on and so on. And as a result, the 20th century has cast a lot of light on principles of oral transmission. And so if we look at these principles of oral transmission in non-literate societies, it doesn't mean that there's no writing. It just means that most people live their lives in a writing-free environment. They've never learned to read, never learned to write. And so memory, not writing, kept records. Remember in the book of Ruth when Boaz finally decides that he wants to redeem Ruth and marry her? And he goes to the village elders sitting at the gates, and he makes his case, asks for the closer next of kin to claim Ruth. He doesn't. Boaz does. Deal's done. And it's now all recorded in the memory of the elders. Well, stories were preserved and corrected in communities. When my own children were young and these ideas were very fresh in my mind, I tried to change stories that they knew well. Like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You try to introduce a fourth bear. Oh no, Papa. Or Goldilocks and the Three Munchkins. Oh no, Papa. One of my MDiv students, a Indonesian, did his master's thesis on the subject of could you introduce new characters into the traditional shadow plays of Indonesia, the wayang plays, using shadow puppets. They're based on the Hindu Mahabharata. And he thought that this would be a way to introduce new stories that could possibly contain the gospel in ways that would not be seen as foreign. It was a two-edged sword. Traditionalists wouldn't have anything to do with new characters, and heaven help you if you mess around with the traditional stories. Traditional stories were very resistant to change. Well, the world of the New Testament is very much like that. Mostly non-literate, little reliance on written sources, high reliance on oral sources. We all have heard of Homer's work, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's almost certain that when he composed it, it was not in a written form. It was in a memorized form. Just like the songwriters of today who write songs, they don't write them down. They learn them. Sure, there are professional songwriters going back to Tin Pan Alley that would write it down and then sell it for money. But the composer performers would typically, in the popular world that is, get a complete work and perform it many times before someone else committed it to musical notation on paper. Now let me give you one more example. Let's compare it to the Islamic world of the 7th century. Islam has been on our minds a lot in the last decade, but many people aren't aware of the fact that the Quran existed only in memorized form for all of Muhammad's life and for more than a decade afterwards. In fact, new converts were expected to memorize the Quran. It was recited regularly. They were expected to learn it. They had a tradition for massive memorization. 3 days out of every year, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, before Islam, mind you, the annual pilgrimage was dedicated to people sharing new and lengthy songs that were written, 4 and 5 hours each. You know, they'd feel cheated if you gave them a 30-minute song. And many of the people who were there were able to memorize on one hearing a song of that length. And so they'd go back to their villages and people would say, well, what'd you get from the pilgrimage? Well, come around for the next 3 nights and I'll tell you what I got. In fact, it wasn't until 700 Muslims were killed in a battle in 633, 700 at one time who had the entire Quran memorized, that the successors to Muhammad decided, okay, we can't rely on the Quran existing only in the memories of Muhammad's followers. We got to get it down. And thus, the first written editions were made and finalized. So let me apply this to the synoptic problem in our last 5 minutes here. Well, Jesus' ministry was, by all accounts, about 3 years. And yet, if you go through the New Testament and pick, say, Luke's Gospel, which has more sayings of Jesus than any other, possibly John, I kind of forget at this point, and read the red letter words of Jesus, in either one, you'd be done in less than half an hour. That includes Sermon on the Mount, Sermon by the Sea, all the parables. What was he doing for the other 2 years, 364 days, and 23 hours? The answer is, in my opinion, repetition. If you had a time machine and you set it to go back to hear Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and you calculated it a little bit wrong and you got there an hour too late, you found all the people leaving. What happened? Oh, you should have heard the master teach. Whoa, it's awesome. You'd say, oh, I missed it, the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, darn. But I'm convinced that Jesus' teaching had a pattern, and he taught the same basic idea in different places over and over and over. Let me give you 2 examples that I think brought that home to me more than anything else. First was, I'm with Cru, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, for many years. And Dr. Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, had many positive qualities, but brilliant speaker is not on the list. He had, for decades, 5 basic talks that he gave on almost every occasion possible. And they included, how to be sure you're a Christian, how to be filled with the Holy Spirit, how to love by faith, how to help fulfill the Great Commission. And one time I happened to be sitting at a banquet, and the guy next to me was the young man who'd spent the last year being Dr. Bright's assistant. And he carried Dr. Bright's briefcase and made sure that he got to his plane on time and, did all the errands that a person like that would do. And I said, well, in the last year, how many times did you hear Dr. Bright give, I don't know, how to help fulfill the Great Commission? So, I have no idea. Probably 50. No kidding. I bet you could give that message yourself. I hear it in my sleep. I could give it on a moment's notice anywhere I am. Well, did Dr. Bright always give it exactly the same way? Well, yes, but not exactly. Well, what do you mean? Well, if he was talking to college students, he'd say, you can help fulfill the Great Commission by joining staff. If he was talking to businessmen, he'd say, you could help the Great Commission by giving money, so that there would be a different application. And this is exactly what we see in the Gospels. We see one story followed by several applications all sandwiched together. And it's a fascinating thing to, once you're sensitized to this, to observe all the possible applications and extrapolate what the groups might have been. Then the last illustration, and it's a joke, so it's always comforting to close with a joke here. One of my heroes of physics has always been Albert Einstein. I mean, what's not to love about Einstein? A guy who couldn't even get into an advanced degree program, and so he took a humble job as a patent clerk, and in one incredible year wrote 3 papers that changed the world of physics forever, knocked them upside down. The scholars at the University of Basel said to themselves, who is this guy? And somebody had the brilliant idea to say, we better give this guy a PhD before somebody else does. And so they took his paper on Brownian in motion, made him a PhD, and ta-da, from then on, Dr. Einstein had his PhD from the University of Basel, one of the smartest moves ever. So the story goes that before his face was well known to anyone outside the physics community, he had been sent on a lecture tour. The U.S. government was flying and driving him around to lecture to physics departments all over the United States. And at first he enjoyed it, but then he just got so bored. And he got to be good friends with his chauffeur. And his chauffeur said, "You're bored. I have to listen to the same talk over and over. Why, I could give your lecture, Dr. Einstein." And they had the same brilliant idea. "All right, next university, we're going to trade positions. I'm going to drive. I'll wear your chauffeur's hat. You be Dr. Einstein, and you give my lecture for me. It'll be a blast." And that's exactly what happened. So the chauffeur gave the lecture letter perfect, except they forgot one little thing, the question and answer period at the end. One of the professors, one of these hard, nasty, mean physics professors, stood up and said, "Dr. Einstein," and then he proceeded to ask the most difficult question you possibly could in the physics world. The chauffeur listened and listened, and he thought, and when he was finally absorbed the question, he said, "Ha! Why, that is such an easy question. Even my chauffeur could answer it." So, I'm not comparing Jesus to Einstein's chauffeur, but I think the principles by which the Gospels came to us are true and valid. Now, next time, I'll try to take on the intermediate books, mostly the early letters, the letters of Paul. So thanks for staying with me. Thanks for all of you who wandered in. And this will be on the internet in the next couple days, so you can catch up if you missed anything. Let me close in prayer. Father, thank you so much for the Gospels, the New Testament that you gave us, that we can know your will, know your thoughts, know the events of history into which Jesus was born. Pray that you'll encourage us with the reality of this testimony. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay.
Come and bring some friends next week. You want to get this on the internet? Yeah, where on the internet?
Nice to see you early birds, you vultures for education.